Okay. So, when a company actually is considering to implement SAP, okay, or any ERP, they first actually sit down internally for scoping and they document every department and the processes and they go over the requirements. They also look at how many users they will be wanting with user licensing, pricing, and of course, with how much of returns ROI can it generate for them. Okay. So moving forward a little bit fast, the process is actually finalized with documentation where every department, whether it's finance, HR, materials, production, CRM, sales, transportation, logistics, everyone actually sits down and they make actually teams, and teams are led by department owners, department managers, or director of ERP or director of that department, head of department. Okay. So there are many dynamics and parallels to ERP implementation. It brings in change management and, of course, a lot of expectations and disappointments as well in terms of terminations, perhaps, and job promotions. But of course, the workload actually increases with ERP implementation, and everything is working under the responsibility of project director. Okay. So once the scoping document is finalized with the process and it is collected, the next step is to call in the vendors that give demos, and they actually show their team and discuss how they will implement it. They show their machines and demos and their processes and ERP. And after that, that round actually takes like 2 to 3 months with various companies. Okay, maybe 6 months, maybe 1 year. And after that, once it is finalized, the companies are called to bid and quote for the project. And these companies actually know by that time how much of the scope is to be done, how many hours will be required, how many consultants and how expert consultants will be required. So the quotation is put down for all these modules, along with the profile of experts, project director profiles, managers, change management experts, and consulting companies. Of course, the high cost, low cost is a point and element to consider, but for companies, big companies, multinational companies, this is the last point to consider. They actually go over the deliverable set plus the quality that would be given as an extension, as an add-on with every step of the project. The first and foremost is quality, high price tag. If the process is smooth, you can beat your competitors. And if a project is won by a company, for example, IBM wins the project or our company wins the project, they actually get down and meet with the teams to get the understanding of the project with 0-day training first before even starting to run and install SAP. And that 0-day training basically is to understand the ecosystem, the environment of the client, of the consulting company, and they sit down together. Speaking of HR, of course, there are many segments and teams in HR department like training, recruitment, hiring, payroll, work scheduling, taxation, and so on and so forth, learning and development, events, and leave management, and of course, other areas. So likewise, there are other managers as well, like inventory, warehouse, production. Everyone actually has to sit down and collect all the processes. So implementation partners are many around the world, and they can also outsource some of the work, or they can actually take up to implement on their own with their own team, and their own team, like companies from IBM, Accenture, will of course have a direct impact with the understanding of the ecosystem of the companies. Global rollouts are much, much bigger um, projects. So why companies are not inclined or willing for HCM in the first part? Because of the comfort level with the legacy software, the SAP licenses, and the migration and everything. The understanding, the training can be a little bit daunting and difficult for the companies, but eventually they actually have to migrate. And since because there is a shortage of consultants as well, and they actually face that shortage, but they also pay very high to HCM consultants. So HCM is basically a very primary and fundamental module that actually works towards the success of the entire company, because people, you have to manage people and the system around the people. So system landscape, if you talk about, there are three kinds of landscapes in SAP, which is basically run by basis consultant. The first one is development server, which will have configuration, development, customization, testing, research, sandbox. And of course, this development server will actually have configuration plus testing plus everything, transactions and whatnot will be developed in this area. Okay, anything that will be developed over here will be tested and then passed on to quality. Okay, so in HCM, of course, you will build your organizational hierarchy, the employee formats, their records, their databases, their master data, their payroll, their taxation, and everything will be configured in SAP. And then, of course, when it is all okay, when you think your process that you have done in the scoping document that I spoke of earlier, after matching that, you will bring that configuration to quality, where the client will actually test it and get trained on that, and you will be preparing test scripts. So test scripts will be matching their process with SAP process, and that process mapping is basically between the as is process, which is the old process, between the old process and the new process of SAP. And that actually has steps to be followed, which are testing steps, where, of course, we match transaction data, master data, integration data, and that will be confirmed and ratified and endorsed by BPOs, users, and project managers. And those test scripts are basically either approved, not yet approved, or rejected out of scope. That totally depends on the project managers. So the structure and architecture of SAP is pretty much uh, huge and gigantic, and it basically runs on multiple servers and multiple layers of RAM and memory and databases. So SAP itself is an evolution in the ERP industry, and it evolves the companies as well. There are three types of projects that you will come across in your SAP career. That is implementation projects, which is greenfield; support project, which is after the project has gone live. Then there are rollout projects, which are again for upgrades. Then there are enhancement projects. For example, if your company wants to have an additional submodule for, let's say, quality management or transportation, or wants to integrate their app on the cloud, that will be called an enhancement project. Then there are upgradation migration projects, which that could be greenfield implementation or brownfield. Brownfield means that there was SAP already implemented, and based on the existing processes in SAP, you actually migrated from an older version of SAP to the newer version, that is S/4HANA. So all the projects are basically done, developed, and concluded using the ASAP methodology, which is pretty much like the waterfall method, but now they have the accelerated SAP methodology, which is, of course, you interview the client, they give you the process, you configure it then and there, you run it, you test it, you get the approval, and then move on to the next process. Okay, and that actually ensures smooth success in the project. So first is project preparation, then comes in the scoping from the client side. Then the next part, this is basically the project phases. First is project preparation, where you meet the company, you give them the demos, you give them the scoping, the bidding, the quotation, and then you actually sit down with the company and give them the scope of the project, as what modules will be necessary to implement and why it will be necessary. And in that, you also give demos, working functionalities, integration, everything. And after that, when you win the project, business blueprinting starts, which is requirement gathering. You ask them, take surveys, you take interviews, you talk to them, you discuss, you challenge them, you fight with them, and you actually agree on some process, and you disagree, and you actually uh, agree to bring in some processes into SAP, and some are basically not in use in SAP, not supported, and those are actually either customized or thrown out altogether. So all processes, basically, your job is to find solutions in SAP, and you have to map that using functional processes, functional solutions, or technical solutions using the ABAP programming languages. Where processes are actually not being mapped with SAP, then there are gaps. Those gaps are then filled up using either customization, or that you actually force the client or coerce the client to actually accept SAP as a standard. Even if the client does not agree with that, then of course you go for gap processes. Gap processes basically are areas and processes of companies which are not readily accepted or available as solutions in SAP, which are not in the scope of SAP. Those are called gaps. And you actually make a list of that. You research and make a viable solution. A middle way solution is given, whether it should be customized or not. And that actually is then given a list and prepared and submitted with the client, that some of the processes will be customized, and those customized processes are called user exits, because SAP is exiting for the user process and through customization. And RICEF is basically the short form for reports function. I can't recall this. I'll recall this in the next one. Okay. So the process in SAP is pretty much simple. The first is realization after blueprinting, which is configuration. Once the configuration, development, customization is done, then comes the testing, and then pre-go live, and then go live. Pre-go live is when you prepare every system and all of the data is actually prepared and put in a server, preparation server before the go live. It is reconciled by the client. And when it is reconciled, you actually give a date for go live, and you actually announce the date, and on that very go live date, you actually cut over, that is a cut over date, and you shift and migrate from legacy to SAP with a transaction code, and you celebrate that moment. After that, of course, it's post go live support. Implementation methodology, I've already told you, it's basically ASAP implementation or accelerated. So I've already told you blueprinting is basically a collection of all processes, old, new, required, not required, important, very important, urgent, not very urgent. That actually comes into blueprinting along with the gap analysis. Okay, and requirements, of course, has compatible and non-compatible processes. Okay, then there can be changes in SAP licenses. You might actually have to increase the number of licenses for users. Okay, and of course, after looking at the compatibility issues, you actually sit down with the client, analyze the gaps and those gaps, and then discuss with the technical team. And those technical team will actually advise whether customization is advisable or not. Okay. If there are non-compatible processes, it leads to more layers of SAP processes, which are user exits. Okay. And after the approval of blueprinting, of course, you actually set the guidelines to be sent to the consultant to configure the whole systems. And then, of course, the testing part, the development part, the configuration part actually follows through. And once all the development is done, and then, of course, every part, every step is documented along with the user management, user licenses, and authorization metrics for the users. Everything is then passed on and transported to the quality server. And once it is in quality server, the client actually checks the quality, the integrity, the synchronization, the matching of the process with their own legacy process and business processes. And after that, when it's done, it actually moves through the UAT phase, where it is put put for user acceptance testing, and it is up either for approval or rejection. Once it is approved, it is a major milestone in an SAP project, and then you actually go for reconciling, uploading the data, master data, transaction data, integration data, and prepare the pre-go live SAP server. And once it is reconciled by the client with all the values, transaction mastered and everything, and backlogs for every module, which is finance, HCM, CRM, production, warehouse management, material management, and there can be a load of big data in that server. So the client has to actually go through that operation, and that might actually take like 2 weeks. And after that, once it's reconciled, you actually go for the go live. And that is a big event. So speaking of versions of SAP, it started with 2.1 and then 2.2 and onwards. It went on to actually upgrade itself, and it kept upgrading until it reached ECC 5, and then came ECC 6, S4 HANA, HANA 1606. Now it is 1909, and there might be another upgrade as well, which I'm not aware of. Okay, so there is a family of SAP system, and there are many modules in SAP which that run on the premise and on the cloud nowadays also. But speaking of these R3 system, what is R3 is basically R means real time, plus 3 is the 3 layers of the SAP, which is 3 layers are the top layer is called the presentation layer, the screen layer where the user interacts with SAP. Then comes the application layer where the code, the configuration is sitting, which is the middle layer, and then comes the database layer. In that R3 system, of course, we have these many modules. And then SAP has divided industrial solutions for every specific industry like retail, oil and gas, media, medicine, apparel, and so on. Okay, and there are like 22 to 23 such solutions in SAP. So the modules in SAP that are basically uh, out of R3 are these ones basically, and HCM can be considered as one of them because HCM was basically not developed in SAP, it was acquired and then it was integrated into SAP. But nonetheless, it's still very powerful. Speaking of big data, as I mentioned earlier, data warehouse actually is one of the major elements of SAP, and that data warehouse follows the principle of or the layers of ETL, which is extraction, transformation, and loading that big data into blocks and dashboards. And that actually become your reports. And that is basically, again, a very big part for the management. Okay. I hope you're clear by this time. We will actually stop our lecture here today.